opportunity. So I have the pleasure, or not, to talk to you about ALPPS. Let's start with my disclosure that I've not done a single ALPPS case since 2016, so I may be a little bit biased. You know that ALPPS was introduced in 2012. It has had a huge wave of success ever since its inception, and there was a lot of discussions regarding the procedure. You may or may have not understood that this is from Grey's Anatomy. So she says we will save a few patients with the ALPPS procedure. So ALPPS made it into American mainstream TV, so it really made it. It's a definite success. I'm going to show you these slides, and people will say to me, well, these are old slides, Eric, what are you talking about? 2015, and you see on the right side, this is the mortality of ALPPS, the 90-day mortality of ALPPS in colorectal liver metastases compared to some standard studies. I'm just showing these slides in order to show you that that was the status quo in 2015. So when we looked at mortality in colorectal liver metastases, the results from the registry and the results from single and multiple center reports were devastating for us. And the same is true for primary liver tumors as well. Here is hepatocellular carcinoma on the left, and then perihilar cholangiocarcinoma. And like I said, this is the early experience up to 2015. At the time, I got very involved with ALPPS. I started the first ALPPS registry in Zurich in collaboration with a lot of people who may and may not be here today. It was a resounding success in the beginning because everybody loved this procedure. What concerned me the most, being the kind of administrator, the guy who started it, who kind of like programmed it and so on, was the mortality. The mortality that was reported was quite high. You may or may not know the reports. I published those in several papers. And in this paper, I was primarily interested to understand why are people dying. And the result of this paper for me was, you look at these red circles there on the left side, the direct cause of death. That was basically the reason why people ultimately die of septic shock. And then the dominant complication that when we looked at bile leaks, cachexia, acute kidney injury, and all these things that occur in the course when a patient spirals down, it was always deterioration of liver function that was in the center of things. And then when we assessed these patients with liver failure criteria, the majority of people had liver failure. So it's not just that we operated on people who were too old, who had too many comorbidities and so on. And my conviction since these analyses that I've done, and these were 28 mortalities in the second report on the ALPPS registry, was the people die because they don't have enough liver function after a procedure that was supposed to support liver function. And when we looked at the volumes, and you know that, ALPPS is a hypertrophic procedure that accelerates hypertrophy, and I've called it rapid hypertrophy, what ALPPS induces. The liver grows faster and within a shorter period of time, and we know that, and so it didn't make a lot of sense. And it has never really made a lot of sense to me, and I've always kind of oscillated between saying, well, it's too much surgery on the one side, with too many complications, bile leaks, etc., or it's a liver function problem. And you may be aware of the study from the Amsterdam group, where we looked at a bunch of patients with ALPPS, and we found that the liver was growing well, but the function was not. And although we never really, and this was HIDA scan based in terms of liver function assessment, and although we never really were able to nail this down in humans, and because we were never able to nail this down in humans, I initiated a series of experiments in rats where we used functional MRI, and this is going to be presented on Friday with my postdoc. And we did that in the University of Zurich in my lab at the time, and we studied rats because we wanted to have a standardized model, and we compared ALPPS versus portal vein ligation in rats. And we also looked at liver resection. And when we look at these slides, you see increase of liver function and volume, and the empty squares or the empty things are volume, and the full ones are function. And what you see here is that when you study this in MRIs in rats, is that on day one the function is very bad, and then it catches up. and it actually gets better than the volume increase if you assess it with this technology. And when you look at PVL, portal vein ligation, on the right side, it paints a very different picture. But what it tells us is that function and volume are indeed simultaneous in the growth after ALPPS. So my conviction was wrong, that there was something wrong with the volume, the functional gain in ALPPS. The function and the volume gains are consistent. And if you look at these three slides, these three panels, on the left side is ALPPS, in the middle is liver resection, portal vein ligation, on the right side, same rats. Here, in red, you can see liver function of the deportalized lobe, and in orange, you see the liver function of the FLR. And if you were to choose between one of those, you can see that there's no red after post-op day number 1 in liver resection in the middle, of course, because there's no supporting deportalized lobe, right, in liver resection, right? You can see how bad the liver function in this rat in the middle on post-op day number 1 is. So this is why extended hepatectomies are dangerous, right? Because you're dealing with only 20% liver function. Whereas in these augmentation procedures on the left and the right, these regenerative liver procedures, you can see that the global liver function drops, but it doesn't drop below 60%. It is around 60% on day 1. And if you were to choose one of those procedures here, of course you would choose, if you would choose the ALPPS procedure, look at the difference between, it's subtle, but look at the difference between portal vein ligation and ALPPS. So ALPPS has a considerable functional gain. It's not dysfunctional volumetric growth. So this is my first conclusion. I wanted to show you these basic science data because I think they're informative, they're interesting, and we're going to discuss this forever because there's going to be a ton of studies coming out in humans to say one and the other, but these are standardized animals under laboratory conditions, and I think it's important, an important study. Now anyways, so more and more I got convinced there must be all the other things, the too much surgery things that make ALPPS bad. And in 2017 I gave a talk in Mainz on the EAHPBA meeting where I said, who does not, it was about ALPPS lessons learned, I said patients who does not qualify for ALPPS, patients who are older than 60, patients with colorectal metastases who are not undergoing regional liver function testing, patients with colorectal metastases who have a high likelihood to achieve resectability with PVE, right? Of course, patients with primary liver tumors. Now let's see what happened since then. First of all, the randomized trial. The randomized trial showed us, LIGO from the Scandinavian group, that the mortality and complication rates were pretty similar between the two groups, ALPPS and two-stage hepatectomy with PVE. So ALPPS really doesn't fare that badly, although I gotta say the complications and mortalities in both groups are pretty high. The other thing I was talking about in Mainz 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, was that it was really sad, and I called that the ALPPS oncosurgery reality, that people are doing ALPPS and colorectal metastases without giving people neoadjuvant or induction chemotherapy. And there was this one study that was done by the Linkerping group where they looked at the ALPPS registry and they found that among 452 patients, 68 did not get any chemotherapy, and we were surprised that we had bad outcomes with ALPPS and colorectal liver metastases. And we did a survey, and that's on the right side at the time, with Hernande Alacanda's group in Ontario, Canada, and we asked surgeons, ALPPS surgeons, you know, how do you routinely recommend that your patients get systemic neoadjuvant chemotherapy? And 32% said no. So that was a disaster. And you know, later on, now we get analyses from the registry, here 2020 by the Zurich group. And you know, when you look at the overall experience here, it doesn't look too bad. I mean, you know, 2 years, 3 years, 28% survival is not a bad outcome for any, you know, two-stage hepatectomy type procedure. So ALPPS in the single cohort study doesn't fare too well. The problem I have with all of these database analyses that have come out from the registry over the last few years is look at the fine print, you know. In addition, centers outside of the ALPPS registry were contacted to contribute cases retrospectively. ALPPS centers contributing 10 or more cases to ALPPS registries was outside of the registry with an experience, blah, blah, blah. You have no clue what patients are included here. It's not like consecutive experience of the initial ALPPS centers, the more experienced ones. You can select cases the way you want to present nice outcomes to you in forums like that. And these ALPPS arithmetics, as I call them, just don't make any scientific sense. They don't help us at all. When I look at this study, for example, Linköping database analysis back then, 45 patients out of 452, 2012 to 2016, and then later on, the Zurich group, 510 over a much longer time period, because again, some centers were excluded because they were not large enough, etc. And then you have suddenly 22 centers, and then you have suddenly 41 patients in a much longer time period who had no chemotherapy. So who can make sense of this stuff? Anyway, we have some systematic reviews. As usual, they're borderline helpful. This is a systematic review that was done with a very good intent, I think, from the group in Valencia in Spain. They looked at the few studies, and you can see there are only 5 of them really, that kind of did a comparative analysis, not all retrospective, so nothing is randomized. And they show that the 90-day mortality complication rate between ALPPS and two-stage hepatectomy is not different, nor is survival, overall survival. But we have a randomized study, and I can't say it often enough. It is so great that in 2015, Per Sandström's group in Linköping did this randomized trial, because without them, we would really be completely lost in the sauce with all of these registry data from Zurich. And the randomized trial had a late analysis on survival, and that was quite interesting. There was a difference, and the difference was pro-ALPPS. So I'm going to say another good thing about ALPPS on my talk today. I can say, wow, when randomized perioperative outcomes of ALPPS are analyzed, they are not worse than conventional two-stage hepatectomy, and when randomized, ALPPS and colorectal metastasis seems to somehow improve survival over TSH, and this is not registry stuff, this is real data. And then let's talk about HCC. In Mainz, when I gave my talk, I gave the Oscar for the worst scientific evidence to the data on HCC in ALPPS, and basically showed the one big study that was done at the time from the registry by the Munich group with my collaboration, where we basically showed that there was a 30% survival difference at 1 year, whether you did ALPPS or standard PVE resections in patients with what I call intermediate stage HCC. And I said, ouch, you can see that there. And, so it wasn't really a good experience. And I gotta say, I gotta give that Oscar to the worst scientific evidence. Again, this year, to the data on ALPPS in HCC, really nothing much has changed. When you look at the systematic review that was done by David Nadov's group from Yale, the biggest study around is still the study that we did with Munich in 2016. So, and this is, I'm talking comparative studies. But there's some interesting single-center studies that I would like to talk about. I think the conclusion that David draws in his paper, where he says ALPPS, on the other hand, is able to achieve faster and higher rates of FLR hypertrophy, but carries a much higher risk of major complication, which is based on this table on the left, where you can see that ALPPS complications are much higher than the ones with PVE in his meta-analysis, and it may lead to a little bit more resectability, 98 versus 91%, but he concludes, in the meantime, PVE balances safety, timeliness for HCC patients with prior liver hypertrophy, prior hepatectomy. I think we can still not recommend a two-stage hepatectomy like ALPPS for HCC. But there are 2 interesting studies. I want to mention this one from Albert Chan in Hong Kong, primarily because it shows you can do ALPPS with a 0 mortality. There are a few studies out there, single centers, that say, hey, we can really do it well, and I think Albert did it well. What he showed here is that partial split stuff from Zurich, didn't make any sense in his patient population. Actually, the partial split people did grow less and so on, and that's why I always show that graph as well, because I think it's interesting about that study. But more interesting is this study from Zhangjiang Hospital in Shanghai, that big liver resection center in China, and where they really show that it is a modality that in the Asian patient population has better results than their TACE experience, and also a better result than their single-stage population. Now, this is retrospective data, but I think it shows a trend that we saw as well in the colorectal liver metastases data from Linköping in the late analysis on survival, that ALPPS may improve survival over taste in an oncological sense when you remove these tumors as opposed to just tasting them. And so I think that is an important piece of data. And now I go to cholangiocarcinoma as an indication. And my verdict was quite devastating in 2017, and Hauke Lang wrote a nice little editorial where he said this unacceptable high mortality was a homicide argument that he used, which might as first things have suggested that surgery for parahilar cholangiocarcinoma in ALPPS shouldn't be performed at all. And he apologizes that the data weren't very good and it was a first experience and so on. And ever since that time, the data have gotten so much better. So look at those three papers. I know I'm likely pissing off a bunch of people here if I say that, we really don't need any more case reports on ALPPS. We just don't. I mean, go ahead and do your fifth variation on this procedure, call it mini ALPPS or type with a typo, parahilar cholangiocarcinoma with an E. But all this is published in Annals of Surgery because it is just what happens. When we did an analysis, Andreas Schnitzler and me, on publications on ALPPS, well, they're all, when you look at the different journals, they're all pretty balanced. There's one journal that stands out. One journal with an editorial board comprised of certain people, in which positive reports on ALPPS are just common, and you can publish the best studies on ALPPS. If they're negative about ALPPS, you won't get into Annals of Surgery, I can tell you that right now. But if you have a case report on a new variation on ALPPS, even with a typo, you can get it into Annals of Surgery, no problem. So, one important study in the cholangiocarcinoma arena for me was the Lee Nadelin study, because I think you did a great job analyzing the data there. And again, we find something here that we also find in the Linköping experience on colorectal liver metastases and in the Zhang paper on HCC, which is we may actually really profit from removing tumor with ALPPS in patients when we compare them to patients in the SEER database that did not get any resection at all and that may have been candidates using techniques like ALPPS. So patients with locally advanced cholangiocarcinoma do better when they get resected with ALPPS than when they get palliative chemotherapy. That's the conclusion from that study, and I think it is an important thing to pursue. The scores, are they game changers? Well, I'm not sure. I was always convinced that people after ALPPS die from liver failure, and so I'm going to just skip on that a little bit. This has been supposedly an advancement. I've never found it an advancement, and the reason why I say that is because a bad procedure does not become a better procedure when it is performed under better circumstances. I do think, however, that there is a reason why rapid hypertrophy has an impact on survival in surgical oncology. When you hit hard with first-line chemotherapy, if you have the right induction therapy, which honestly saying in cholangiocarcinoma, we're not exactly sure whether we have that, but we are making progress in that field for sure. And you remove all tumor as fast as possible and limit chemotherapy exposure, you reduce clonal heterogeneity and chemotherapy resistance. And I knew I was speaking after Emmanuel, so I didn't want to say much about that, but I think that the minimal invasive type of rapid hypertrophy looks really good. My graphical conclusion is this. It has to be done minimal invasively. ALPPS is a dinosaur. Is going to die out. And my conclusions are ALPPS introduced rapid liver hypertrophy into liver surgery. The initial experience was challenged by bad outcomes. There may be an improvement with better patient selection and learning curve in technique. I put here maybe, because I don't trust the registry data. However, with less invasive alternatives to induce rapid hypertrophy, ALPPS may become entirely obsolete. There may be a use for ALPPS in salvage. I didn't talk about that because my successor will talk about that, and I will leave that up to him. And I want to make one little comment to a nice little quote that was in this paper by the three founders of the ALPPS registry, or godfathers, let's call them, of the ALPPS registry, where they said failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. You see the dinosaur on the right. Sometimes failure is not, unfortunately, an opportunity to begin again. Thank you.